CEO laughs at the simple woman during the flight, but an emergency made the pilot reveal who she is. Richard Morgan couldn't stop laughing. He discreetly pointed at the woman sitting 3 rows behind and whispered comments to his 2 partners. The passenger wore a light beige scarf on her head and simple clothes that completely contrasted with the luxurious environment of the executive jet flying from New York to Washington, D.C. "Look who managed to sneak into first class," he said, loud enough for her to hear. "Must have saved miles her whole life to be here." The woman kept her eyes fixed on the window, her hands resting on a worn-out bag in her lap. She couldn't have been more than 40-something, but the marks on her face suggested a life of hard work. Richard turned completely in his seat, without the slightest embarrassment. "Robert, make a note to increase surveillance on our flights," he commented to one of the partners. "This kind of people doesn't match the standard we want to offer." The other partner, Michael, gave a nervous laugh and tried to change the subject, but Richard was too entertained by the situation. He had just closed the biggest deal of his career, the purchase of 3 private hospitals in Washington, D.C., and felt invincible. At 42, he had built an empire in the private healthcare field, known both for his business vision and his explosive personality. The flight attendant, a young woman named Jennifer, approached offering drinks. Richard ordered an expensive whiskey, and when the woman with the scarf asked only for water, he let out another laugh. "Water?" Of course, she must not be used to anything better anyway. Jennifer felt her face heat up with second-hand embarrassment, but followed protocol and served the water with a professional smile. The woman thanked quietly and went back to looking out the window. Her name was Elizabeth Carter, but nobody there knew that yet. She carried important documents for a meeting at the ministry in her old bag, but that was also a secret that would remain hidden for now. In the cockpit, Commander William Thompson piloted the aircraft with the calm of his 25 years of experience. Through the internal camera system, he periodically observed the passengers. Something about that woman with the scarf caught his attention. There was something familiar about that face, but he couldn't identify what. "What an annoying guy that Richard Morgan is," commented the co-pilot Andrew, who was also watching the cameras. "Every flight it's the same thing. Thinks he owns the world." William agreed silently, but his mind was elsewhere. Where had he seen that passenger before? The answer danced at the tip of his memory, but refused to materialize. Richard continued his performance. He got up from his seat with the whiskey glass in hand, pretending to go to the bathroom but stopping right next to Elizabeth. "Sorry for the curiosity," he said with a fake smile. "But what do you work as, a cleaner, a cook?" Elizabeth finally turned her face to him. Her eyes were a deep brown, calm like still waters. She didn't answer, just held her bag tighter. "Oh, I see," Richard continued. "Must be one of those who survives on odd jobs, huh? Well, at least you got lucky today. Got to experience how the other half lives." Robert called Richard back, trying to control the situation that was getting more and more awkward. But the businessman was enjoying every second. He returned to his seat but kept making comments, always loud enough for Elizabeth to hear. "You know what bothers me," he said to the partners. "It's that these people think they deserve the same as us. They work simple jobs, didn't study, didn't make an effort, but they want to travel in first class as if they had built something in life." Michael was visibly uncomfortable. He had known Richard for 15 years since college and knew his friend had a cruel side that emerged especially when he felt powerful. This was clearly one of those moments. The turbulence began subtly, small jolts that made the glasses tremble on the trays. In the cockpit, William checked the instruments and didn't like what he saw. An unpredicted storm front was forming ahead of them. "Andrew, tell the passengers to fasten their seatbelts," William ordered, keeping his voice calm and professional. The warning was given and Jennifer walked down the aisle, ensuring everyone was secure. Richard, of course, complained about having to tighten the seatbelt, saying it was too tight, that he paid a lot for comfort, not to be treated like cattle. The turbulence worsened abruptly. The plane shook violently, making the overhead compartments vibrate. Richard's glass, which he had insisted on keeping in his hand despite the warning, flew from his fingers, and the hot coffee he had just ordered spilled all over his designer white shirt and then splashed toward Elizabeth, staining the sleeve of her simple blouse. Instead of worrying about the stain or apologizing, Richard immediately took his wallet from his jacket's inner pocket. He counted out some $100 bills and tossed them onto Elizabeth's lap with a disdainful gesture. "Here, buy a better outfit. That one was already ugly anyway." Elizabeth picked up the bills calmly, folded them, and put them in her pocket. Her face showed no anger, no humiliation, only a deep serenity that, if Richard had been more attentive, would have made him feel an inexplicable discomfort. Jennifer quickly approached with towels and cleaning supplies, mortified by the whole situation. "Mr. Morgan, please, we need you to remain seated," she said, trying to maintain professionalism while cleaning up the mess. "Do you see how considerate I was?" Richard continued, speaking to his partners, but looking at Elizabeth. "I gave her money. I bet it's more than she makes in a week." Elizabeth pulled an old phone from her pocket, a simple model that must have been at least 5 years old. She started typing something, her fingers moving quickly over the small keys. Richard saw this and burst into more laughter. "Look at that. A brick like that still exists." He pointed at the device. "I bet she doesn't even know how to use it properly. Probably just texts her family asking for money." Michael finally found the courage to intervene. "Richard, stop it. The young lady isn't bothering you." "Bothering?" Richard turned to his partner with an air of superiority. "She's not bothering me. I'm just being honest. We live in different worlds, and she needs to understand her place." Elizabeth continued typing, her fingers never stopping. On the small screen, she was writing a long message to someone. When she finished, she put the phone back in her bag and looked out the window again as if nothing had happened. The turbulence eased a bit, but William knew it wasn't a good sign. Storms like this often had deceptive moments of calm. He checked the route and saw they didn't have many diversion options. They would have to go through it. At the back of the cabin, an older passenger began to move uncomfortably. His name was Joseph Miller. He was 68 years old and was visiting his daughter in Washington, D.C. He tugged at his shirt collar, feeling a tightness in his chest that he tried to ignore. Richard, oblivious to everything, continued his conversation with his partners, now discussing plans for the new hospitals. "The first thing we'll do is create a stricter triage system," he explained, drinking from a new glass of whiskey. "No more endless lines with people who can barely pay. We'll focus on those who can actually afford the costs of premium care." "But what about the more popular insurance plans?" asked Robert. "They bring a volume of patients." "We'll only accept top-tier insurance plans," Richard Morgan replied firmly, "and even then, be selective. The goal is to turn these hospitals into a reference for those with real money. Those who can't pay should go to the public system." Elizabeth Carter, who until then seemed detached from the conversation, turned her head slightly. Her eyes briefly fixed on Richard, but he didn't notice. Michael, however, noticed the movement and felt an inexplicable shiver run down his spine. "Do you know her?" Michael whispered to Robert, discreetly pointing toward Elizabeth. "Never seen her before," Robert replied, also in a low voice. "Why?" "I don't know. There's something familiar about her face, but I can't place it." The conversation was interrupted by another violent jolt of the plane. This time, the overhead compartments opened and some bags began to fall. Jennifer ran down the aisle, trying to ensure everyone's safety. In the cockpit, William was wrestling with the controls, while Andrew communicated with the control tower. "Commander, the tower reports an unmapped low-pressure zone on our route," said Andrew, the tension evident in his voice. "How many minutes until we're through?" William asked, remaining calm. "About 10, 15 at most. Maintain constant contact with the tower. I want to know about any changes immediately." And then something happened that no one expected. A piercing alarm began to sound in the cockpit. Andrew looked at the instruments and his face paled. "Pressurization compromised," he announced, his voice trembling slightly. William acted the next instant. He triggered the emergency protocol, and the oxygen masks dropped from above each seat. The recorded voice of the safety system filled the passenger cabin, instructing everyone on how to put on the masks. Panic was instantaneous. Passengers screamed. Some tried to stand up despite their seatbelts. Richard, who seconds earlier felt like the master of the world, was now desperately struggling with his mask, his hands shaking so much he couldn't adjust the straps. "It's not working!" he shouted, his voice muffled by the noise around him. My mask isn't working. Robert and Michael were also struggling with their own masks, panic taking hold of both of them. Richard's mask hung crookedly on his face, oxygen escaping from the sides. He began to hyperventilate, which only made the situation worse. Elizabeth, in contrast, put on her mask with calm, precise movements. She adjusted the straps with a familiarity that suggested training. Then, without hesitation, she released her seatbelt and stood up. Jennifer was trying to calm a family with children a few rows ahead. Elizabeth passed by her and went directly to Richard. Her firm hands took his mask and, in 2 quick movements, properly adjusted it on the businessman's face. She pressed the sides, ensuring there were no leaks, and held his face firmly, forcing him to look into her eyes. "Breathe slowly," she said, her voice clear and authoritative, cutting through the panic. "In through your nose, out through your mouth, slowly." Richard obeyed, hypnotized by that voice and those eyes now inches from his. Gradually, his breathing began to normalize. Elizabeth held eye contact for a few more seconds, ensuring he was stable before stepping away. She moved through the aisle, helping other passengers. An elderly lady couldn't reach her mask. Elizabeth carefully took the mask and placed it on the woman's face, checking the fit. A young businessman was having the same problem as Richard. Elizabeth repeated the procedure, her voice always calm, always in control. Robert and Michael watched the scene in disbelief. The woman Richard had humiliated minutes before was now saving not only his life but those of several other passengers. And she did this with a calmness and efficiency that didn't match her simple appearance. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. Elizabeth returned to her seat and fastened her seatbelt again, checking that everyone around her was secure. Richard was now watching her with different eyes. The arrogance had vanished, replaced by confusion, and what might have been the beginning of shame. The pressurization was gradually restored, but the danger hadn't yet passed. William kept the plane steady as he navigated through the storm. Thick raindrops hammered against the windshield, and lightning lit up the dark clouds around them. That's when Joseph Miller, the 68-year-old passenger, really started to feel unwell. He had managed to put on his mask during the depressurization, but now he was pale and sweating cold. His left hand gripped the armrest so tightly that his fingers were white. His wife, seated beside him, noticed first. "Joseph, Joseph, are you okay?" He tried to answer but only groaned in pain. His right hand went to his chest, clutching the area of his heart. The symptoms were unmistakable. "Someone help me!" his wife shouted, panic raising her voice an octave. "My husband is very sick." Jennifer rushed over to them, quickly assessing the situation. She picked up the microphone and made the announcement no one wants to hear on a plane. "Is there a doctor on board? Please, if there's a doctor among the passengers, we need immediate assistance." The silence that followed was tense. Passengers looked at each other, hoping someone would step forward. Richard, Robert, and Michael remained in their seats, useless. None of them had any medical knowledge. Elizabeth remained seated for 3 more seconds. Then, for the second time, she unfastened her seatbelt and stood up. She walked down the aisle with firm, determined steps until she reached the row where Joseph was. His wife looked at Elizabeth with a mix of hope and despair. "Are you a doctor?" she asked, tears already streaming down her face. Elizabeth didn't answer the question. Instead, she knelt beside Joseph and began a quick but thorough assessment. She checked his pulse, then the color of his nails, and then lifted his eyelids to examine his eyes. "How long has he been in pain?" she asked his wife, her voice calm but urgent. "About 5 minutes, maybe more. It started as a discomfort in his chest and got worse." "Does he have a heart history? Is he on any medication?" "Yes, he had a minor issue 3 years ago. He takes medication for blood pressure and cholesterol." Elizabeth nodded and turned her attention back to Joseph. "Sir, can you hear me? If you can, squeeze my hand." Joseph's hand weakly squeezed Elizabeth's fingers. She continued her assessment, asking specific questions about the pain, its location and intensity. Her questions were precise, technical. They weren't the questions of someone providing basic first aid. They were the questions of an experienced professional. Jennifer approached with the plane's first aid kit. Elizabeth quickly opened it, assessing the contents. There was aspirin, bandages, some basic pain and allergy medications, but nothing specific for cardiac emergencies. "Do we have a defibrillator on board?" Elizabeth asked Jennifer. "Yes, it's in the compartment near the cockpit." "Bring it immediately." The way Elizabeth gave the order left no room for questions. Jennifer ran to get the equipment. Meanwhile, Elizabeth began preparing Joseph. She helped him recline his seat, loosened his tie and the top buttons of his shirt. "I'm going to need space," she said, looking at the passengers in the nearby seats. "If you could move back a little." The passengers obeyed immediately. There was something in her voice, in the way she moved, that inspired absolute confidence. Richard had stood up and was on his tiptoes, trying to see what was happening. His earlier arrogance had completely disappeared, replaced by a mix of fascination and confusion. Jennifer came back with the defibrillator. Elizabeth opened the case, and her face grew tense for the first time. She examined the device quickly and then looked at Jennifer. "When was the last maintenance on this equipment?" I'm not sure." "Why?" Elizabeth didn't answer. She turned on the defibrillator and immediately saw that something was wrong. The indicator lights were blinking irregularly, and the device emitted an intermittent beep that wasn't normal. "It's faulty," she said, keeping her voice controlled despite the situation. "We'll have to improvise." Joseph's wife sobbed loudly, but Elizabeth was already in motion. She grabbed aspirin from the first aid kit and instructed Joseph to chew it. Then she began a series of careful maneuvers, pressing specific points on his body, constantly monitoring his pulse. "Is he having a heart attack?" his wife asked, her voice breaking. "His heart is under stress," Elizabeth replied, choosing her words carefully. "I'm doing what I can to stabilize him, but we need to land as soon as possible." Jennifer picked up the interphone and spoke directly to the cockpit. "Captain, we have a medical emergency. Passenger with suspected serious heart trouble. The doctor attending to him is requesting an emergency landing." In the cockpit, William processed the information quickly. A doctor. He looked at the camera screen and saw Elizabeth kneeling beside Joseph. And then, like a bolt of lightning, the memory came back. 3 years ago, a public hospital in New York. His mother in the emergency room with chest pains. The doctor who came rushing in, who took control of the situation, who worked for hours to stabilize her. The same doctor who later refused to accept any special gratitude, saying only that she was doing her job. That face. Those eyes. It was her. "Andrew," William said, his voice filled with recognition, "that passenger there is no ordinary woman. I know her. She's Dr. Elizabeth Carter." "What do you mean? Who is she?" "One of the top cardiologists in the country. She saved my mother 3 years ago in a public hospital. It was a case that made the news at the time because she refused to accept a medical award, saying it made no sense to reward someone for doing the basic duties a doctor should perform." Andrew looked at the screen again, seeing Elizabeth working with precision and calm. "And what is a doctor of that caliber doing dressed like that, traveling in business class?" "I don't know," William replied, "but we need to land immediately. If she's asking for an emergency landing, the situation is serious." William checked the instruments. The nearest airport was Newark, about 15 minutes away, but the storm was right over the city. Landing there would be risky in those weather conditions. "Tower, this is Executive Flight 321, William spoke on the radio, "requesting emergency landing. We have a medical emergency on board." "Flight 321, understood. Newark Airport is closed due to severe storm," the tower voice responded. "Nearest available is Teterboro, 22 minutes from your current position." William pressed his lips together. 22 minutes could be too long. He looked at Andrew, who was already recalculating the route. "Do you have any closer options? Any runway we can use?" There was a pause on the other end of the radio. "Negative, Flight 321. Closest alternative is Teterboro." In the passenger cabin, Elizabeth continued working. Joseph Miller was more stable, but his condition was delicate. The chest pain had lessened with the aspirin and the maneuvers she was performing, but the risk was still high. It was then that Elizabeth noticed something most people wouldn't: the way the plane was turning, the descent angle. She knew those movements well. She had flown enough on humanitarian medical missions to recognize when a pilot was looking for an emergency route. She looked up, toward the cockpit, and then turned her attention back to Joseph Miller. But her mind was working on multiple fronts. The patient in front of her needed immediate care, but she also needed to understand what was happening with the plane itself. Jennifer was beside her, following all the instructions Elizabeth gave. The flight attendant, who had initially been merely embarrassed by the humiliation Richard Morgan imposed on the passenger, was now completely in awe. "How long have you worked as a doctor?" she asked quietly, while Elizabeth checked Joseph Miller's pulse again. 23 years, Elizabeth replied without taking her eyes off the patient. "I graduated at 22, specialized in cardiology at 25. "And have you always worked in emergencies?" "Not always. I spent years in private practice, then specialized in cardiac surgery." She paused, adjusting Joseph Miller's position. "But 10 years ago, I decided I wanted to do something different, something that really mattered." Richard Morgan, who was close enough to hear the conversation, felt something strange stir inside his chest. Shame. Real and profound shame. He had humiliated that woman, thrown money at her as if she were a beggar, and now she was saving a passenger's life with a competence he could never comprehend. The turbulence returned with force. The plane shook violently, and Elizabeth had to hold on to avoid falling onto Joseph Miller. But even so, her hands never let go of his wrist, continuing the constant monitoring. And then, something new happened. A child a few rows ahead started coughing. They were wet coughs, followed by wheezing in his breathing. The child's mother looked around with eyes wide with terror. "Luke, what's happening?" she asked the 8-year-old boy, whose face was now turning red. Luke tried to respond, but his voice came out only as a frightening wheeze. His hands went to his neck, a universal gesture of someone who can't breathe. The mother screamed, drawing everyone's immediate attention. "He can't breathe. Someone help me." Elizabeth looked at Jennifer. "Stay with him," she said, indicating Joseph Miller. "Keep monitoring his pulse. If it falls below 60, call me immediately." She stood up and ran to where the child was. Luke's lips were now beginning to turn blue, his eyes wide with panic. Elizabeth knelt beside him and immediately began asking the mother rapid questions. "Does he have any known allergies?" "Yes, peanuts, but he didn't eat anything. I swear he didn't eat anything." "Does he have an epinephrine injector?" "It's in my bag." The mother dove into her bag, her hands shaking so much that things fell to the floor. Lipsticks, wallets, keys, everything scattered as she searched desperately. Elizabeth remained calm, holding Luke's face and looking directly into his eyes. "Luke, look at me. You're going to be okay, but you need to stay calm. Can you do that for me?" The boy nodded weakly, his eyes fixed on hers. There was something in that gaze that conveyed such absolute confidence that even in the midst of his panic, Luke managed to calm down slightly. "Here." The mother finally found the epinephrine injector. Elizabeth took the device and quickly checked its expiration date. It was within the time frame. She exposed Luke's thigh, positioned the injector, and administered the injection in a quick, precise motion. She counted 10 seconds before removing the device. "Now we wait," she said to the mother, who was crying uncontrollably. "The epinephrine will start to take effect in a few minutes." But Elizabeth wasn't content just to wait. She continued monitoring Luke, checking his breathing, the color of his nails, the response of his pupils. And as she did so, her mind was working on something else. She looked around the cabin. People were frightened, some crying, others in shock. 2 passengers with medical emergencies. A severe storm. An airplane trying to find a place to land, and her in the middle of it all trying to keep everyone alive. But there was something more, a pattern her medical mind was beginning to identify. Luke's reaction had been sudden, without him having eaten anything. That wasn't common in peanut allergies. Usually there was a clear trigger. "What did he eat in the last few hours?" Elizabeth asked. "Just the snack I prepared at home," the mother replied. "Cheese sandwich, box juice. Nothing with peanuts. I always check everything 10 times. "And here on the plane?" "Nothing. He only drank a bit of soda that the flight attendant offered. Elizabeth stood up and went over to Jennifer, who was still monitoring Joseph Miller as instructed. What kind of soda was served? Jennifer seemed confused by the question. Regular soda. Why? Bring me a sealed can. I want to see the label. Jennifer obeyed, running to the small kitchen on the plane and returning with a can. Elizabeth examined the label carefully, turning the can to read the ingredient list, and there it was, in small letters, may contain traces of peanuts. That's why, Elizabeth murmured to herself. Luke was starting to breathe better. The epinephrine was taking effect. His color was returning to normal and the wheezing was decreasing. His mother held his hand, crying with relief. Elizabeth went back to check on Joseph Miller. His pulse was stable, though still weak. He was conscious, which was a good sign, but she knew they needed a hospital as soon as possible. In the cockpit, William made a decision. He couldn't wait 22 minutes. He had 2 passengers in critical condition and a doctor who was working miracles with limited resources. He needed to find an alternative. Andrew, is there any private landing strip in the area? Anything with a paved runway? Andrew quickly checked his maps. There's one 12 minutes away. Short runway, but we should be able to manage. It's a private field used for training planes. That's what we have. Inform the tower we're heading there. The decision was communicated to the passengers. They were going to make an emergency landing at a private field. The news brought a wave of relief, but also tension. Emergency landings always carried risks. Elizabeth heard the announcement and immediately began preparing both Joseph Miller and Luke for the landing. She instructed Jennifer on how to position both, how to protect them during the landing, what to do if there were complications. Richard Morgan watched everything from his seat. He hadn't moved since the emergencies began. His hands were clasped, his knuckles white from how tightly he held them. Robert and Michael were equally tense and silent. The plane began its descent. The rain continued to beat heavily against the windows, and lightning lit up the dark sky. William piloted with all his experience, every movement calculated and precise. Andrew constantly communicated their position to the tower. 3 minutes to landing, William's voice came over the sound system. Elizabeth knelt between Joseph Miller and Luke, one hand on each of their wrists, monitoring both simultaneously. Her face was calm, focused. There was no fear there, only deep determination. 2 minutes. The plane shook with another gust of wind, but William quickly corrected it. The private airfield runway appeared ahead, wet and glistening in the rain. 1 minute. Elizabeth held Joseph Miller and Luke's wrists tighter. Jennifer was beside her, holding Joseph Miller's wife's hand with one hand and Luke's mother's with the other. All 4 women united in that moment of maximum tension. 30 seconds. The wheels touched the ground with a strong but controlled impact. The plane slid along the wet runway, and William applied the brakes gradually, avoiding skidding. The sensation seemed to last an eternity, but it was only seconds. The plane came to a complete stop. For a moment, there was total silence. Then someone started to applaud. Others joined in. Within seconds, the entire cabin erupted in applause and shouts of relief. But Elizabeth had no time for celebrations. She was already giving instructions to Jennifer on how to prepare the 2 patients to be removed from the plane. Ambulances were on their way, but it would take a few minutes for them to arrive. William left the cockpit and walked through the passenger cabin. His eyes met Elizabeth's immediately. She was kneeling beside Joseph Miller, but looked up when she felt someone approaching. "Dr. Carter," William said, his voice full of emotion. "You saved my mother 3 years ago, and today you saved 2 lives here on this plane." Elizabeth stood up slowly. For the first time, her face showed fatigue. She had been under intense pressure for the last 30 minutes, saving lives with minimal resources, and the strain was beginning to show. "I remember your mother," she said softly. "Mrs. Martha, how is she?" "Well, very well, thanks to you." "I'm glad to hear that." Richard Morgan approached slowly. His legs felt like they weighed tons. He stopped a few steps away without the courage to come closer. Elizabeth noticed his presence but said nothing. Richard began, but his voice failed. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I need to apologize." Elizabeth looked directly into his eyes. There was no anger there, no judgment, just a kind of quiet sadness. "Apology accepted," she said simply. "No, you don't understand," Richard continued, the words pouring out in a desperate rush. "I was horrible. I said unforgivable things. I treated you like someone inferior," Elizabeth finished, without emotion in her voice. "I know. It wasn't the first time that's happened, and it probably won't be the last. But I was wrong, completely wrong." "I'm just a doctor doing my job," Elizabeth interrupted him, "and now I need to make sure these two patients get proper care when the ambulances arrive." She turned to go back to the patients, but Richard took a step forward. "Please, let me do something. Anything. My hospitals, my resources, everything is at your disposal for whatever you need." Elizabeth stopped and looked at him over her shoulder. "You really want to help?" "Yes, anything." "Then stop judging people by their appearance. Stop thinking that money or status makes someone better or worse." Her voice was calm, but every word cut like a blade. "And most importantly, stop thinking that those who work with the less fortunate are wasting their time or are inferior." Richard lowered his head, unable to maintain eye contact. Michael and Robert watched from a distance, equally ashamed by association. The sirens of the ambulances began to sound outside. Paramedics quickly entered the plane, bringing stretchers and medical equipment. Elizabeth immediately began briefing them on the patient's condition, providing precise and detailed medical information. One of the paramedics, a man of about 50 named Maurice, looked at her with growing recognition. "Dr. Carter, is that you?" "Hello, Maurice," Elizabeth greeted with a small, tired smile. "It's been a while. I was your student in the emergency medicine course you taught about 5 years ago at the municipal hospital. I remember you well. You were one of the best in the class." Maurice turned to the other paramedics with a proud smile. "Everyone, you're in the presence of a legend. Dr. Elizabeth Carter is one of the top cardiologists in the country. She could be at any luxury hospital making fortunes, but she chose to work in the poorest communities." The information hit the passengers who didn't know like a bombshell. Murmurs of surprise and admiration filled the cabin. Richard felt himself shrink even more if that was possible. Joseph Miller was carefully placed on the stretcher. Before being taken away, he held Elizabeth's hand. "Thank you," he said, his voice weak but sincere. "You saved me." "You're strong," Elizabeth replied, gently squeezing his hand. "You'll be fine. But when you get to the hospital, they'll want to run some more detailed tests. Let them do it, okay?" He nodded, and his wife squeezed Elizabeth's other hand with silent gratitude before walking alongside the stretcher. Luke was much better now. The epinephrine had worked perfectly, but as a precaution, the paramedics also wanted to take him to the hospital for observation. His mother held Elizabeth in a tight hug. "You saved my son," she sobbed. "I don't know how to thank you." "Seeing him grow up healthy," Elizabeth replied with a genuine smile. "That's all the thanks I need." When the patients were taken away, the cabin finally began to empty. Other passengers disembarked, many stopping to thank Elizabeth or simply look at her with admiration. She accepted the thanks modestly, always deflecting the credit to the emergency team or to William's skill in landing. Richard remained seated until almost everyone had left. Robert and Michael said goodbye to him with meaningful looks and disembarked. Finally, only Richard, Elizabeth, Jennifer, and William remained on the plane. Elizabeth picked up her old bag and the scarf that had become slightly crooked during all the chaos. She straightened it carefully, her movements calm despite everything that had happened. Richard stood up and slightly blocked the aisle, not aggressively, but in a clear request for her to stop and listen to him. "Dr. Carter," he said, and this time his voice was different. There was no trace of arrogance, only genuine humility. "I've spent my whole life building an empire, thinking that made me better than others. Today you showed me how wrong I was, how small I am." Elizabeth studied him for a long moment. "You're not small, Mr. Morgan, no one is, but you were choosing to see only a very limited part of the world, and that was making you make poor decisions. How do you know my name? I know who you are, I know your hospitals. In fact, I tried to work at one of them a few years ago." Richard blinked, surprised. "Tried? What happened? I was rejected. They said my approach to care was incompatible with their business model. I insisted on treating all patients the same, regardless of how much they could pay. Apparently, that was a problem. Richard felt as if he'd been punched in the stomach. One of his hospitals had rejected this extraordinary woman because she refused to discriminate against patients. That will change, he said, and for the first time in his life, he was making a promise he intended to keep, not for profit or advantage, but because it was the right thing to do. All my hospitals will change, I promise. Promises are easy to make in moments of emotion, Elizabeth replied, but her voice wasn't cynical, just realistic. The hard part is keeping them when the emotion fades and routine returns. Then let me prove it. Give me a chance to show I can be different. Elizabeth watched his face for a long moment. She saw something there she hadn't seen before, perhaps the beginning of a genuine transformation, or perhaps just the temporary shame of someone caught being cruel. Time would tell. "All right," she finally said. "But it's not me you need to prove something to. It's all the patients who were rejected, all the healthcare professionals who tried to make a difference and were prevented, all the people you and people like you deemed unworthy of quality medical care." She stepped around Richard and walked toward the exit. At the door, she stopped and looked back one last time. "Oh, and Mr. Morgan," she said, "the notes you threw at me earlier. I'm donating them to the clinic where I work. They need suture materials." And with that, she descended the airplane stairs and disappeared into the rain that was still falling lightly. Richard stood there for several minutes, staring at the empty space where she had been. Jennifer approached quietly, holding her own bag. "She's amazing, isn't she?" the flight attendant whispered. "More than that," Richard replied, his voice hoarse. "She's what I should have been." William appeared in the aisle, already in civilian clothes. He put a hand on Richard's shoulder. "Mr. Morgan, I know it's not my place to speak, but I've flown with you many times. I've seen you treat many people the way you treated Dr. Carter today." He paused. "I sincerely hope this changes." Richard nodded, unable to speak. William said goodbye and disembarked. Jennifer stayed a moment longer. "If it's any consolation," she said, "I think you can change. The fact that you're so shaken shows there's still something human in there." She too was gone, leaving Richard alone in the empty plane. He walked slowly to the exit, his legs heavy. The rain had stopped, and the sun was beginning to appear between the clouds. A new beginning, he thought. Perhaps there was still time to become a better person. But before he could disembark, his phone rang. It was Robert. "Richard, I just found out. The meeting in Washington, D.C. about the hospitals has been postponed to next week. You have time to return to New York and reorganize things." Richard looked at the sky, where the storm clouds were dissipating. "I'm not coming back," he said. "What do you mean? We have scheduled meetings, contracts to review." "Cancel everything. I need to do one thing first." "What thing?" "I need to visit a clinic." He hung up before Robert could ask more. Richard disembarked and looked around. Elizabeth was on the other side of the airfield, talking on the phone. He started walking toward her but stopped halfway. No, this wasn't how it should be. He couldn't just show up and expect to be accepted after everything he had done. First, he needed to prove he was capable of real change. He needed to show through actions, not words. Richard took out his own phone and made a call. "Sandra, it's me. I need you to arrange an urgent meeting with all the hospital directors." "Yes, all of them." "No, it can't wait. It has to be today." He paused, listening to his secretary on the other end. "I don't care if it's Sunday. Find everyone and tell them that whoever doesn't show up can look for another job." He hung up and looked to where Elizabeth had been, but she was already gone. A taxi was disappearing down the road, taking her wherever she needed to go. Richard didn't know it yet, but this would be the day that divided his life into before and after. Before, when he was a successful but empty businessman. After, when he would begin to understand the true meaning of success. But the path to redemption is never simple. And Richard was about to discover that changing himself was just the first step. Changing an entire system would be much more difficult. As Elizabeth sat in the taxi, she closed her eyes for a moment. She was tired, very tired. Not just physically, but emotionally. Every time something like this happened, every time she was judged by her appearance, every time she needed to prove her worth, it took a piece of her energy. But she was also used to it. 23 years in medicine, 10 of which dedicated to the poorest communities, had taught her that the world doesn't change overnight. Changes happen slowly, person by person, heart by heart. "Where to, doctor?" the taxi driver asked, and only then did she realize he had said doctor and not ma'am. He knew her. "You know who I am?" "Of course I do. You operated on my daughter 2 years ago, heart problem." "Art. The doctors at the private hospital said it would cost a fortune I didn't have. Then someone told me about your clinic. You operated on my Julia for free." Elizabeth smiled, remembering the case. A 15-year-old girl with a congenital defect that could have killed her at any moment. "How is she?" "Perfect. She started college this year. Wants to be a doctor just like you." "That's great. I'm very happy. That's why when I saw you here at the field, I offered the ride for free. It's the least I can do." "You don't have to. I'll pay for the ride as usual." "No way. By the way, where are we going?" Elizabeth looked at her watch. Her meeting at the ministry had been rescheduled due to the emergency landing. She was free for the rest of the day. "To the clinic," she said. "There's always work waiting." The taxi drove along the road. Elizabeth looked out the window, watching the airfield fade behind her. She thought about Richard Morgan and his promises. She had seen many such promises before. Some kept them, most didn't. But she had also learned not to lose hope. Because sometimes, just sometimes, people really changed. And when that happened, the domino effect could be extraordinary. The clinic where Elizabeth worked was in one of the outskirts of New York, in an area where asphalt competed with mud on the streets and houses crowded together. The clinic building was modest, 3 stories of painted white concrete that was already starting to peel. When the taxi stopped in front, there was a line of people waiting. Even though it was Sunday, the clinic maintained an on-call service for emergencies. Elizabeth got out of the car, thanked the driver again who refused to accept payment, and walked toward the entrance. The people in line recognized her immediately. Some waved, others smiled. An elderly lady held her hand as she passed. "Dr. Beer, my grandson is better. The medicine you prescribed worked." "That's good, Mrs. Henderson. But don't forget to come back next week for follow-up." "Don't worry, doctor." Inside the clinic, the activity was intense. The receptionist, Carla, looked up from the old computer that took forever to load anything. "Doctor, I didn't know you were coming today. Wasn't the meeting in Washington, D.C.? "There was a change of plans," Elizabeth replied, without going into details. "How many patients are waiting?" "About 20, maybe more. Dr. Regina is seeing them, but she's alone. Dr. Paul called saying he's stuck in traffic." "It's okay, I'll take over from here." Elizabeth went up to the 2nd floor where the offices were. She changed out of her travel clothes into a simple white coat and tied up her hair. She looked at herself in the mirror for a moment. Even tired, even after everything that had happened that day, she was ready to work. It was what she always did. It was who she was. The first patient was a middle-aged man with chest pains. As she examined him, her mind briefly drifted back to Joseph Miller on the plane. She did this sometimes, connecting her patients to one another, seeing patterns, trying to understand not just the illness, but the person behind it. "How long have you had this pain?" "About 3 months, doctor, but it got worse today." "Do you smoke?" "I used to. I quit 2 weeks ago." "Congratulations. I know how hard that is." She continued the examination, asking questions, observing, listening. "I'm going to order some tests. Nothing too expensive, don't worry. And we'll start a preventive treatment." The patients kept coming. A child with a persistent cough. An elderly man with high blood pressure. A young pregnant woman worried about her baby. Elizabeth attended to each one with the same attention, the same care, regardless of how simple or complex the case was. It was almost 6 in the evening when she finally took a break. Regina, the other doctor, entered her office with 2 cups of coffee. "You look dead," Regina commented, handing a cup to Elizabeth. "Thanks for the honesty," Elizabeth replied with a tired smile, accepting the coffee. "Seriously, Bea, what happened? You were supposed to be in Washington, D.C. Elizabeth briefly told her about the flight, the humiliation, the emergencies, the forced landing. Regina listened with her eyes growing wider and wider. "My God! And you came to work after that? What was I supposed to do, stay home thinking? Rest? Process everything that happened? You know, normal things that normal people do after traumatic events? It wasn't traumatic. It was just revealing." "Revealing of what?" Elizabeth thought about the question for a moment, taking a sip of coffee. "That no matter how many years I do this, how many lives I save, there will always be people who judge me by my appearance, by what I'm wearing, by where I live, by how much money I have. And that bothers you. Not like it used to, but it's tiring. You know, Regina, sometimes I think how much easier it would be if I had taken one of those jobs at luxury hospitals. Good money, polite patients, top-notch equipment. But you wouldn't be happy." "No, I wouldn't be." They were silent for a moment, drinking coffee and looking out the window at the busy street below. "That businessman," Regina said suddenly, "the one who humiliated you, do you think he's really going to change?" Elizabeth shrugged. "I don't know. I hope so, but I'm not holding my breath. I've seen plenty of people make grand promises after being confronted with their own failings. Some keep them, most forget by the following week. You're very cynical for someone who dedicates her life to helping people. It's not cynicism. It's realism tempered with cautious hope." Regina laughed and finished her coffee. "Well, whatever this guy is going to do or not do, at least today you saved 2 lives. That has to count for something." "It does," Elizabeth agreed. "It always does." Meanwhile, across town, Richard Morgan was sitting in a huge conference room, surrounded by the directors of his 3 hospitals. They all looked confused and annoyed at having been summoned on a Sunday. "Gentlemen," Richard began, his voice firm, "you must be wondering why I called you here so urgently." "You bet we are," replied one of the directors, Daniel Phillips, a 60-year-old man with a sour look on his face. "I was at my grandson's birthday party. And I apologize for that, but what I need to say can't wait." Richard stood up and began walking around the table. "Today I had an experience that made me question everything we've built here." The directors exchanged confused looks. "During a flight, I witnessed 2 medical emergencies. 2 people who could have lost their lives. And the person who saved them was a doctor traveling on the same plane as me." "So what?" another director asked. "What does that have to do with us?" "It has everything to do with us. Because this doctor, this extraordinary woman who saved 2 lives with minimal resources, had already tried to work at one of our hospitals, and we rejected her." The silence that followed was heavy. "Who is this doctor?" Michael asked. "Dr. Elizabeth Carter, cardiologist, one of the best in the country, and we rejected her because she refused to treat patients differently based on how much they could pay." "Richard," Michael sighed, "you know as well as I do that our hospitals operate as businesses. We can't give the same treatment to those who pay for the basic plan and those who pay for premium. It's economically unviable." "Is it?" Richard challenged. "Or is it just convenient to think that way?" "You're being emotional," another director intervened. "You had a personal experience, and now you want to revolutionize our entire business model." "Maybe that's exactly what we need to do." The directors began speaking all at once, some agreeing, others vehemently disagreeing. Richard raised his hand, asking for silence. "Look, I know what I'm proposing is radical. I know it goes against everything we've built. But today I saw what we're capable of becoming when we put profit above people. And I didn't like what I saw." "And what exactly are you proposing?" Michael asked, crossing his arms. "I want to review our care policies. I want to ensure that every patient, regardless of their plan, receives the same standard of care. I want to open scholarship programs for doctors who work in underprivileged communities. I want to make our hospitals places where medicine is practiced with dignity and respect for everyone." "That will cost a fortune," someone murmured. Then let's find a way to pay. We cut costs in other areas. We reduce profit margins. I know it's possible because I've seen it done. Where? Michael challenged. In a poor clinic on the outskirts, where a doctor sees dozens of patients a day with a fraction of the resources we have, and still manages to do extraordinary work. The directors continued discussing for hours. Some supported Richard, moved by his renewed passion. Others were skeptical, seeing only the financial risks. But in the end, Richard made it clear that it wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. He was the owner, after all. "You have 1 week," he said finally. "I want concrete proposals on how we're going to implement these changes. Those who can't adapt to this new direction, well, will have to find another place to work." The meeting ended with tension in the air. Richard knew he had made enemies, but he didn't care. For the first time in a long time, he was doing something because it was right, not because it was profitable. When everyone left, Robert stayed behind. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "This could ruin everything we've built. Or it could transform it into something better," Richard replied. "I'm tired of building empty empires, Robert. I want to leave something that really matters." Robert studied his friend for a long moment and then nodded slowly. "Then I'm with you, but it's going to be hard." "I know, but it's worth it." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. The following days were madness for Richard. Constant meetings, resistance from all sides, threats of mass resignations. But he stood firm, pushing his changes even when it seemed impossible. Elizabeth, on the other hand, continued her routine. Clinic during the week, on-call shifts on weekends, and occasionally, when necessary, trips to remote communities where there was a shortage of doctors. She knew nothing about what Richard was doing, and probably wouldn't care if she knew. 1 week after the incident on the plane, Elizabeth received an unexpected call. It was from a number she didn't recognize, but she answered anyway. "Dr. Carter, this is Sandra, secretary to Mr. Richard Morgan. He would like to schedule a meeting with you." Elizabeth felt a pang of irritation. Why wouldn't that man leave her alone? "Thank Mr. Morgan, but I'm not interested in a meeting." "Please, doctor. He insists it's important. He has something he wants to show you." "Look, Sandra, with all due respect, but your boss has already caused me enough embarrassment. I'm not interested in prolonging our relationship. He asked me to say it's not about him, it's about the hospitals, about changes he wants to implement, and he would like your opinion." Elizabeth hesitated. "Changes? What kind of changes?" "All right," she said finally. "But I can only meet next Thursday after 6 in the evening." "Perfect. I'll schedule it and confirm with you." When she hung up, Regina was at the office door with a raised eyebrow. "Was it who I thought it was?" "Yes." "And you accepted?" "Curiosity, I guess. I want to see if he's actually doing something or if it's just more talk." "Be careful," Regina warned. "Powerful men have a way of making you believe anything." "I know how to take care of myself." On Thursday, Elizabeth took a bus to the more upscale area of New York where Richard Morgan's hospital headquarters was located. The building was imposing, all glass and steel, reflecting the grey afternoon sky. She entered the luxurious lobby and gave her name at the reception desk. Immediately she was escorted by a secretary to the elevators. As they ascended, Elizabeth observed her reflection in the mirrored walls. She had come straight from the clinic and still wore her simple clothes. She hadn't bothered to dress up. If Richard had any problem with that, it would be his problem. The elevator opened onto an entire floor that was clearly executive space. White walls, modern art, soft carpet, everything screamed money and power. Elizabeth felt like a fish out of water, but kept her head high. Sandra, who recognized her voice from the phone, greeted her warmly. "Dr. Carter, it's an honor to meet you in person. Please follow me." She was led to a huge conference room. Richard was there, but he wasn't alone. There were 5 other men and 3 women, all dressed formally, all with stacks of documents in front of them. Richard stood up as soon as he saw her. "Dr. Carter, thank you for coming." His tone was respectful, without a trace of his previous arrogance. Please have a seat. Elizabeth sat in one of the leather chairs, feeling everyone's curious gazes. Richard cleared his throat and began. Doctor, these are the directors of my 3 hospitals and some members of the executive board. I've spent the last week convincing them that we need to make significant changes in how we operate. What kind of changes? Elizabeth asked directly. Daniel, the oldest director whom Elizabeth recognized from photos she'd seen in business magazines, spoke. Structural changes to our care policy. Mr. Morgan wants us to treat all patients equally, regardless of their insurance or ability to pay. And you agree with this? Elizabeth asked, looking around the table. There was a moment of uncomfortable silence before one of the women, who introduced herself as Dr. Claudia Ferris, medical director, spoke. Honestly, some of us are skeptical. It's a big change that could significantly impact our profit margin. But we also recognize it might be the right thing to do. Might? Elizabeth repeated. You're a doctor. How can you say might when we're talking about treating all patients with dignity? Claudia blushed slightly. I understand your perspective, Dr. Carter. But we also deal with economic realities that you, working at a community clinic, might not need to consider. Elizabeth leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Claudia. You think I don't deal with economic realities? I work with a budget that's probably smaller than what you spend on coffee for this office. Every penny counts. Every decision about buying equipment or medicine has to be weighed carefully. And yet, we don't discriminate against anyone. With all due respect, another director interjected, the scale is different. You serve dozens of patients, we serve thousands. And how many of those thousands do you turn away because they can't pay enough? Elizabeth challenged. Richard slammed his hand on the table, not in anger, but to get attention. That's exactly why I invited Dr. Carter here. We need to hear a different perspective. We need to understand that it's possible to practice quality medicine without discriminating against patients. But there are costs involved, Daniel insisted. Real costs that impact the hospital's functioning. Then let's find ways to cut other costs, Richard responded. Reduce executive salaries, for example. This caused a murmur of protest around the table. Elizabeth watched everything carefully, beginning to understand the magnitude of what Richard was trying to do. It wasn't just a policy change, it was a complete corporate culture transformation. Mr. Morgan, she said, her voice cutting through the noise, may I ask a question? Of course. Why are you doing this? And don't tell me it's because of what happened on the plane. Changes this big require more than a momentary epiphany. Richard took a deep breath, and when he spoke, his voice was filled with genuine emotion. Because I spent 42 years of my life building things without ever stopping to think about the real impact I was having on people. I built hospitals that are benchmarks in technology, but that close their doors to those who need it most. I created an empire that feeds my ego but doesn't make a real difference in the world. He paused. And then I saw you working on that plane. I saw how you saved lives with almost nothing, and I understood that I was doing everything wrong. Elizabeth studied his face, looking for signs of insincerity, but all she saw was a man genuinely trying to change. All right, she said finally, I'll help you, but on one condition. What? I don't just want to help with policies on paper. I want to see real implementation. I want to visit the hospitals, talk to the staff, see how patients are treated. And if I feel this is just a marketing move, I'll leave immediately and tell everyone who asks that it was all a fraud. Richard didn't hesitate. I accept. When can you start? I have a full schedule at the clinic, but I can dedicate 2 afternoons per week, Thursdays and Saturdays after 3 p.m. Perfect. And so began an unlikely partnership. In the following weeks, Elizabeth began visiting Richard's 3 hospitals. She observed how patients were treated, talked to doctors and nurses, reviewed care protocols. What she found disturbed her. There were 2 clear realities. Patients with premium plans received private rooms, personalized attention, quick access to specialists. Patients with basic plans stayed in shared rooms, waited hours for care, had limited access to resources. She documented everything and presented it to Richard and the directors. The meetings that followed were tense, with Elizabeth not holding back criticism and many directors feeling attacked. "Look at this case here," she said in one of the meetings, showing documents. Mrs. Mary, 63 years old, basic plan, waited 4 hours to be seen for chest pain. When she was finally seen by a doctor, he spent only 5 minutes with her and prescribed something without doing proper tests. 2 days later, she had a heart attack. "But she survived," someone murmured. "She survived by luck," Elizabeth answered, her voice raised for the first time. If she had been properly attended to on the first visit, the heart attack could have been prevented. "Dr. Carter," Daniel spoke calmly, "we do the best we can with the resources we have." "No, you do the best you want with the resources you have. There's a huge difference." Richard, who had been quiet until then, spoke. "The doctor is right, and this ends today. I want new protocols implemented immediately. All patients, regardless of their insurance, must have the same minimum consultation time. Everyone must have access to the same diagnostic tests, no exceptions." "That's impossible," another director protested. "We'll triple the waiting time for everyone. Then we hire more doctors. And where will the money come from?" "Out of my pocket if necessary." Richard slammed his hand on the table. "I don't care. This will be done." The meeting ended in tension. When everyone left, only Elizabeth and Richard remained in the room. "You made a lot of enemies today," she commented. "It's not the first time, but I also don't care anymore." "Why are you doing this, Richard?" "Really?" He looked out the huge window that overlooked the city. "Because my father died in a public hospital waiting for care. I was 17. We spent hours in the waiting room, watching him get worse, and no one did anything until it was too late." He turned to her. "I swore that day that I would never be poor again, that I would build something big, that I would have enough power to never depend on anyone. And you did." "I did. But in the process, I became exactly the person who let my father die. Someone who chooses, who deserves to be saved based on the money they have." His voice trembled. "I can't go back in time and save my father, but I can make sure other families don't go through what mine did." Elizabeth felt something move inside her, understanding, empathy, even respect. "You never told me that on the plane." "It wasn't the time, and besides, I was too busy being a jerk." She laughed softly, and he smiled too. It was the first time there was a genuinely light moment between them. "You know," Elizabeth said, "when you invited me to help, I thought it would be a waste of time. I thought you would make some cosmetic changes and then go back to normal when the cameras went away. And now? Now I think you can really make a difference. If you don't give up." "I won't give up." And he didn't give up. Despite the resistance, despite the costs, despite some directors resigning and needing to be replaced. Richard moved forward with the changes. But not everything was about the hospitals. As the weeks passed, a strange thing began to happen between Richard and Elizabeth. They started talking about things beyond work, about their lives, their dreams, their regrets. "Have you ever been married?" Richard asked one day after a long meeting. "Once," Elizabeth replied. "It lasted 3 years. He couldn't handle the hours I worked, my dedication to the patients. He said I loved medicine more than him." "And was it true?" "No. But it wasn't a lie either. I loved them both in different ways. But he needed me to choose. So I chose." "Do you regret it?" she thought for a moment. "Sometimes. Usually at night, when I come back to an empty house. But during the day, when I'm saving lives, improving someone's reality, no. During the day, I know I made the right choice." "And you?" she asked. "Have you ever been married?" "I am." Richard's answer surprised her. "At least officially. We've been living apart for 5 years, but we never signed the divorce papers. She lives in Miami with our 2 children. Why did you separate?" "For the same reasons as you, I guess. I worked too much, was always absent." "But in my case, it wasn't because I was saving lives. It was because I was building an empire I didn't even know why for." "Do you see your children?" "Rarely. They're 15 and 12. They barely know me. I'm more of a financial provider than a real father." There was real sadness in his voice. Elizabeth felt a pang of sympathy. It's not too late, you can change that. Can I? After years of absence? It won't be easy. But if you really want to, you can. You've proven in recent weeks that you're capable of difficult changes. The conversation stayed on Richard's mind. That night he called his children for the first time in months. The conversation was awkward, full of uncomfortable silences, but it was a start. Meanwhile, at Elizabeth's clinic, things were changing too. News about her work with Richard Morgan's hospitals had spread. Other hospitals started approaching her, wanting consulting. She refused most, didn't have the time or energy, but accepted a few cases where she felt she could make a real difference. Regina watched everything with concern. You're spreading yourself too thin, Liz. You can't be everywhere at once. I know, but it's an opportunity to multiply the impact. If I can convince more hospitals to change their policies, you'll burn out in the process. You're already working 16-hour days. I'm fine. You're not. You're losing weight, have deep circles under your eyes, and I know you're not sleeping well. Elizabeth knew Regina was right, but she couldn't stop. There was so much to be done, so many people to help. It was on a Tuesday, 3 months after the plane incident, that everything changed again. Elizabeth was at one of Richard's hospitals, reviewing new protocols, when she felt a sharp pain in her chest. She tried to ignore it, thinking it was just fatigue, but the pain got worse. Her vision started getting blurry at the edges. She leaned against a wall, trying to breathe deeply, but the air wasn't reaching her lungs properly. Dr. Carter, a nurse, passed by and saw Elizabeth pale, sweating cold. Are you all right? Elizabeth tried to answer, but her legs gave way. The nurse shouted for help, and in seconds there was a medical team around her. Richard was in a meeting upstairs when he got the call. He dropped everything and ran to the emergency room. When he arrived, Elizabeth was already on a gurney, being taken to the emergency room. What happened? He asked one of the doctors. Sudden collapse, possibly cardiac. We're doing a full evaluation now. She's a doctor, one of the best cardiologists in the country. I know who she is, the doctor replied. And I also know that doctors are the worst patients. I bet she ignored her own symptoms until she couldn't anymore. Richard stayed in the hallway, unable to do anything but wait. Robert showed up half an hour later, having been informed by Sandra. How is she? I don't know. No one tells me anything. I'm not family. Richard, you're pale. Sit down. I can't. She can't. His voice failed. She can't be unwell. Not after everything. Robert looked at his friend with growing understanding. You care about her, more than you should. Richard didn't answer, but he didn't need to. The truth was written clearly on his face. 2 hours later, a doctor finally came out to speak with him. It was Dr. Peter Mitchell, one of the hospital's cardiologists. Mr. Morgan, Dr. Carter is stable. It wasn't a heart attack, but a combination of severe exhaustion, dehydration, and extreme stress. Her body just gave out. Can I see her? She's sleeping now. We gave her sedatives. But tomorrow, yes, you can visit. Richard slept at the hospital that night in an uncomfortable hallway chair. He didn't want to leave in case she needed anything. In the morning, he was informed that Elizabeth had woken up. When she entered the room, she was sitting on the bed looking out the window. She turned when she heard the door open. You shouldn't be here, were the first words she said. Good morning to you too, Richard replied, approaching. How are you feeling? Ashamed, I'm a doctor. I should know when my own body is reaching its limit. We all do that sometimes. We push ourselves beyond what we should. You don't understand, Elizabeth said, frustration in her voice. I have people depending on me, patients who need me. I can't afford to collapse. And it won't help them at all if you kill yourself in the process. She looked at him, surprised by the harshness of his tone. Regina was right, Richard continued, sitting in the chair next to the bed. You're spreading yourself too thin, trying to be everywhere, helping everyone. But you're human too, Elizabeth. You have limits too. And what do you suggest I do? Give up on my patients? Stop trying to make a difference? No. I suggest you accept help. I suggest you delegate. I suggest you build a team instead of trying to do everything alone. I don't have the resources for that. Then let me help. My hospitals have resources. We can create a program where doctors from my hospitals rotate through your clinic. We can provide equipment, medications, whatever is necessary. Is this charity? No, it's a partnership. It's recognition that you were right and I was wrong. It's the way I found to finally use my wealth for something that really matters. Elizabeth stayed quiet for a long time. Why are you doing this? And don't give me answers about redemption or guilt. I want the real truth. Richard took a deep breath. Because in the last few weeks working with you, talking with you, seeing the way you live your life with purpose and meaning, I realized I fell in love with the idea of being a better person, and maybe also with you. The silence that followed was heavy. Elizabeth looked him in the eyes, searching for insincerity, but found nothing but raw honesty. Richard, you don't have to say anything now. I know it's complicated. I know technically I'm still married, even if it's only on paper. I know you probably still see me as the arrogant jerk from the plane, but I needed you to know. I don't see you that way anymore, Elizabeth said softly. In the last few weeks I've seen you fight against your own system, against your own board members, all to do what's right. I've seen you truly change, and I admire that immensely. But I don't know if admiration is enough. I don't know if I can trust that this change is permanent. I don't know if I can trust you with more than that. That's fair, Richard nodded. Then let me prove it. Let me keep proving every day that the change is real. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Elizabeth was hospitalized for 3 days. During that time, Richard visited daily, sometimes bringing flowers, sometimes just talking. He told her more about his life, about his father, about the regrets he carried. She also opened up more about herself, about the loneliness she sometimes felt, about the fear that all her dedication to medicine was a way of running away from real connections with people. Do you think we're like that? Richard asked during one of these visits. Running away through work? Maybe, but I also think we make a real difference. The point is to find balance, something neither of us is very good at. She laughed and the sound filled the room. Not at all. But maybe we can learn together. When Elizabeth was discharged, Richard insisted on taking her home. She lived in a simple apartment, not far from the clinic. 2 bedrooms, basic furniture, but it was clean and organized, with shelves full of medical books and some photos of places she had visited on humanitarian missions. It's not much, she said, somewhat embarrassed when he looked around. It's perfect, he replied sincerely. It's authentically you. She went to the couch while he insisted on making tea. It was strange having him in her personal space, this man who had started as someone she despised and was now becoming... what exactly? A friend? Something more? When he returned with 2 cups of tea, he sat beside her. I need to tell you something, he said. I called my ex-wife last week. We're finally signing the divorce papers. Should have done it years ago. How are you feeling about it? Relieved, honestly. There hasn't been love between us for a long time, but there's respect, and I think we both deserve to move on officially. And your children, how did they react? Better than expected. I think they've known for years it was just a matter of time, but I'm also talking more with them, planning to visit them during the next holidays, trying to finally be a real father. I'm happy for you, and for them. They drank their tea in comfortable silence. Then Elizabeth said something that had been on her mind. About your proposal, to partner my hospitals with your clinic. What about it? I accept, but with conditions. I don't want it to seem like I'm being funded. I want it to be a true partnership, where both sides contribute and learn. Of course. How do you want to structure it? They spent the next hour discussing details. Young doctors from Richard's hospitals would rotate through Elizabeth's clinic, learning about medicine in underserved communities. In return, Elizabeth would lead workshops at his hospitals on compassionate and ethical care. Equipment and medications would be provided, but the clinic would maintain its autonomy and identity. It was an ambitious plan, but both believed it was possible. In the following weeks, the program began to be implemented. The first doctors from the hospital went to Elizabeth's clinic. Some arrived with arrogant attitudes, expecting to find a primitive and disorganized place. What they found was an efficient operation, a dedicated team, and patients whose stories touched them deeply. A young doctor named Daniel returned to the hospital after his first week at the clinic, visibly changed. "It was the most intense experience of my life," he told Richard in a feedback meeting. "I treated a 70-year-old lady who walked 3 miles to get to the clinic because she didn't have money for the bus. She had severe diabetes and couldn't afford insulin. Dr. Elizabeth not only treated her, but connected her with a free medication program I didn't even know existed. And how did you feel? Useful. For the first time since I graduated, I felt truly useful. At the hospital, I treat patients, yes, but it often feels mechanical. There at the clinic, every person you help, you see the real difference you're making." Richard smiled. That was exactly the kind of transformation he had hoped for. But not everything was smooth sailing. Some of the hospital directors remained resistant to the changes. Daniel, in particular, was becoming increasingly vocal in his opposition. "We're losing premium clients," he said in a heated meeting. "They're going to other hospitals where they know they'll get priority treatment." "Then let them go," Richard replied coldly. "If they don't want to be treated as equals to other human beings, they're not the kind of client I want. You're letting ideology get in the way of business sense." "No. I'm finally aligning my business with my values. There's a difference." Daniel stood up, grabbed his briefcase. "Then I'll take my resignation. I can't be part of this. I accept your resignation, but know that you're on the wrong side of history." Daniel stormed out, slamming the door. Other directors exchanged nervous glances. Claudia finally broke the silence. "Daniel had some valid points about finances. We're operating with tighter margins." "And yet we're still profitable," Richard countered. "Just not as much as before, but what we're gaining in reputation, in patient loyalty, in staff satisfaction, that's worth more in the long run." "Are you sure about that? Or are you betting everything on a theory?" "I'm sure because I've seen it work. At Dr. Elizabeth's clinic, with a fraction of our resources, they manage to do extraordinary work because everyone there believes in what they're doing. We need to have the same belief here." The meeting ended without complete consensus, but Richard wouldn't change course. He had committed to this change and would see it through to the end. Months passed. The partnership between the hospitals and the clinic flourished. More doctors wanted to participate in the rotation program than there were available spots. Richard's hospitals began appearing in the media, but this time not for luxury and exclusivity, but for humanized practices and equal care. Elizabeth was changing too. With more resources available and a larger team, she no longer had to carry everything alone. She was working more reasonable hours, sleeping better, even finding time for hobbies she'd abandoned years ago. And her relationship with Richard was evolving. They now dined together regularly. Sometimes they discussed work, sometimes they just talked about books, movies, life. There was a growing ease between them, a mutual understanding. One evening, after a particularly pleasant dinner, Richard walked her to her apartment door. "Thanks for tonight," Elizabeth said. "I really needed a break." "Me too." He hesitated for a moment. "Elizabeth, there's something I've been wanting to ask you for a while." "What is it?" Do you think we could be more than friends? I know I started everything terribly. I know there's history between us, but I feel like in recent months we've built something real, something worth exploring." Elizabeth looked into his eyes. There were so many reasons to say no. The differences in their worlds, how they met, the risk of mixing personal with professional. But there was also something she couldn't deny. She cared about him. Truly. "Yes," she finally said. "I think we can try." The smile that lit up Richard's face was genuine and transformative. He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. But she didn't. The kiss was gentle, tentative, full of promise for things to come. When they parted, Elizabeth was smiling too. "But let's take it slow, okay?" she said. "We still have a lot to figure out." "Whatever you want. I'd wait a lifetime if necessary." In the months that followed, they navigated their new relationship carefully. Some days were easier than others. There were moments of tension when work intruded, when old behavior patterns tried to resurface. But they always talked, always found a way to work through it. Richard's divorce was finalized. He traveled to Miami and spent 2 weeks with his children. For the first time in years, he was truly present, not just physically but emotionally. The children noticed the difference. There was still distance between them. Years of absence couldn't be erased instantly, but it was a start. When he returned, he told Elizabeth everything. "They asked about you," he said. "What did you say?" "I said I met an amazing woman who's making me a better person, that I'd like them to meet her when they feel ready. And them? Curious, cautious, but not against. My oldest son, Philip, said that anyone who can make his father truly connect must be special." Elizabeth smiled. "I hope I live up to the expectations." "You do. You always have." The first Christmas they spent together was at her clinic. Elizabeth organized a party for the patients and their families. Richard helped organize it, using his connections to get food and gift donations. Robert and Michael also showed up, along with several doctors and nurses from the hospitals. It was a simple celebration, but full of joy. Children ran through the building, music played, there was laughter and hugs. In the midst of it all, Richard looked around and felt something he hadn't felt in years. True contentment. Elizabeth appeared by his side, holding 2 cups of hot chocolate. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "About how a turbulent flight changed my entire life. And do you regret it?" "What I did that day? Absolutely. Everything that came after? Not at all." She rested her head on his shoulder, and they stood there, watching the celebration together. But life is never perfectly smooth for long. Early the following year, new challenges arose. One of Richard's hospitals faced a financial crisis. The changes he had implemented were working from a human perspective, but costs were exceeding projections. Meeting after meeting, trying to find solutions. Cut more costs, seek investors, maybe even consider selling the hospital. Elizabeth found him one night in his office, surrounded by papers, looking exhausted. "You need to rest," she said gently. "I can't. If I don't find a solution, I'll have to lay off staff or reverse some changes. And I don't want to do either. Then let's find another option, together." She sat beside him and they began reviewing the numbers together. It was Elizabeth who had the idea. What if we turned one of the hospitals into a partially non-profit institution? We could seek funding from foundations, get tax exemptions, but still maintain care standards. Is that possible? I don't know, but we can find out. They spent weeks researching, consulting lawyers and financial experts. It was complicated. There was a lot of bureaucracy involved, but it was feasible. One of Richard's hospitals would be transformed into a hybrid organization, part business, part charity. The transformation took months, but when it finally happened, it was revolutionary. The hospital not only became financially sustainable, but also became a model for other institutions. National media covered the story. Richard was invited to give lectures, participate in panels, but he always insisted the credit wasn't his. "It was Dr. Elizabeth Carter who started all this," he said in every interview. "I was just lucky enough to be in the right place and be humbled at the right time to finally open my eyes." His brutal honesty was refreshing in a world of carefully crafted public relations. People responded to it. Elizabeth, in turn, continued her work at the clinic, but now also consulted for several other organizations. She wrote articles about ethical and humanized medicine. She was invited to speak at medical schools. At one of these events, a student raised their hand. "Dr. Carter, what would you say to someone starting their career who feels torn between making money and making a difference?" Elizabeth thought carefully before answering. "I would say they are 2 things that don't have to be mutually exclusive. You can have a comfortable life and still make a significant difference. The question is about priorities and values. If you put profit above people, you'll end up empty, even if rich. But if you put people first and are smart about finances, you can have both." She paused. "And if you have to choose between the 2, choose meaning. Because in the end, it's the lives you touch that matter, not the money you accumulate." The audience applauded, and Richard, who was sitting in the audience, felt pride swell in his chest. 2 years had passed since that fateful flight. Richard and Elizabeth were stronger than ever. They had learned to balance work and personal life, to support each other without losing their own identities. Richard's children visited during the summer and finally met Elizabeth. The first meeting was tense, as expected, but Elizabeth didn't try to force anything. She was authentic, genuinely interested in getting to know them without trying to be their mother or replace anyone. Philip, the oldest, relaxed first. He was interested in medicine and asked Elizabeth many questions about her career. The daughter, Marina, took longer, but eventually opened up too. By the end of the 2 weeks, they were comfortable with each other. "She's cool," Marina told Richard before returning to Miami. "Different than I expected." "How so?" "I don't know. I guess I expected someone more glamorous. After all, you're rich, but she's so real, like regular people. She's the most real person I've ever known. Stay with her, Dad. Seriously. You're a better person with her." That fall, Richard made a decision. During a special dinner he organized on top of a building in New York, overlooking the illuminated city, he knelt with a ring. "Elizabeth Carter, you taught me what it means to be truly human. You showed me that real wealth isn't in bank accounts, but in lives touched and hearts changed." His voice trembled slightly. "I love you more than words can express. Will you marry me?" Elizabeth looked at him, tears streaming down her face. She thought about everything they had been through, how they had grown together, how they had become better people because of each other. "Yes," she said, her voice full of emotion. "1,000 times, yes." The ring slid onto her finger, and they kissed as the city sparkled below them. The wedding was small and simple, at the clinic, surrounded by patients, staff, friends, and family. There was no unnecessary luxury, just genuine love and celebration of two people who had found each other in the most unlikely way. During the ceremony, William, the pilot who had flown the plane that fateful day, was one of the special guests. He gave an emotional toast. "I saw these two at one of their worst moments," he said, raising his glass. "I saw arrogance meet humility. I saw prejudice confronted with humanity. And I saw the beginning of a transformation that changed not just 2 lives, but hundreds, perhaps thousands of others." He looked at Richard and Elizabeth. "May your love continue to inspire change. May you never forget the lessons you learned. And may you always choose to be human first, everything else second." Everyone toasted, and the celebration continued through the night. Months later, Elizabeth was at her clinic when she received an unexpected visitor. It was a young woman, perhaps 25, nervous and clearly intimidated. "Dr. Carter, my name is Julia. I'm the daughter of a taxi driver you met a few years ago." Elizabeth remembered immediately, the young woman she had operated on for free who wanted to be a doctor. "Julia, of course I remember. How are you?" "I'm good, very good," Julia smiled widely. "Actually, I just graduated from medical school, and I wanted to thank you in person for saving my life. Without you, I wouldn't be here today." "How wonderful. Congratulations." "And there's more," Julia continued, her emotion growing. "You inspired me. I want to work with underprivileged communities like you. In fact, I came to ask if you have any openings here at the clinic. I know I probably can't offer much, I just graduated, but I learn fast and—" Elizabeth interrupted her with a hug. "Of course there's a spot. There's always a spot for someone with your heart and dedication." Julia sobbed in the embrace, years of gratitude finally being expressed. It was moments like this that reminded Elizabeth why she did what she did. It wasn't just about saving lives in the present. It was about inspiring the next generation, about creating waves of change that would continue long after her. Richard also had his full-circle moment. Joseph Miller, the man who almost had a heart attack on the plane, showed up at one of the hospitals for a routine checkup. By chance, it was the same day Richard was visiting. "Mr. Morgan." Joseph recognized him immediately. "I don't know if you remember me." "Of course I remember. How are you?" "I'm great, thanks to Dr. Elizabeth. She's been personally following up with me since that day." He smiled. "And I heard you two got married. How beautiful." "Yes, it is. The best decision I ever made." "You know," Joseph said, growing more serious, That day on the plane changed my life too. I almost lost my life, but in the process I learned to live it better. I started valuing time with my family more, taking better care of myself. He paused. And I also learned not to judge people by their appearance. Dr. Elizabeth, with her simple clothes, saved my life, while people in expensive suits did nothing. The words resonated with Richard. It was exactly the lesson he had learned too, but hearing it from someone else made the impact even greater. The partnership program between the hospitals and the clinic continued to grow. More doctors spent time at the clinic, returning transformed. The model began to be replicated in other cities, other states. Elizabeth and Richard traveled across the country giving lectures, consulting, sharing what they had learned. On one of these trips, 5 years after the plane incident, they were on a flight to Boston. Elizabeth looked around the cabin and smiled. "What are you thinking about?" Richard asked. "About how everything has changed. 5 years ago, on this same type of plane, we were essentially strangers. You hated me without knowing me, and I saw you as just another arrogant businessman. And now we're a team, partners in everything, and together we're making a real difference in the world. You're the one making the difference. I just finally woke up. No. We're doing it together. You with your resources and influence, me with my medical experience. Neither of us could have done this alone." Richard took her hand and kissed it gently. "You saved me that day. Not just literally with the oxygen mask, but you saved who I am as a person. You rescued me from becoming a terrible empty man. You saved yourself. I just showed you the way. Still, thank you for everything." The plane took off smoothly, carrying them to another lecture, another opportunity to spread the message of humanized medicine and ethical business. But this time, unlike that flight 5 years ago, there were no storms ahead, just clear skies and a promising future. Years continued to pass. Elizabeth's clinic grew, now occupying a new building with more resources, but keeping its original soul. Richard's hospitals became a reference not only in medical quality, but in ethical and humanized practices. They had a daughter, Sophia, who grew up watching her parents work tirelessly to make a difference. Philip and Marina visited regularly, now fully integrated into the extended family. Philip was studying business administration and talked about working with his father, bringing his own perspective to the hospitals. Marina was in college for psychology, interested in working with mental health in underserved communities. On a Sunday morning, 10 years after the plane incident, Elizabeth was in the kitchen making coffee when Richard came down with a newspaper. "Have you seen this?" he said, showing the cover story. It was about healthcare system reform. Several of the policies Richard had implemented in his hospitals were being considered as a model for broader changes in the sector. The article cited both Elizabeth and Richard as pioneers. "It seems we're finally seeing systemic change," Elizabeth commented, reading the article. "Thanks to you. You started all this." "No, we started it. Together." Sophia entered the kitchen, sleepy and in her unicorn pajamas. At 7 years old, she was already showing signs of having inherited her mother's compassion and her father's determination. "Mommy, are you coming to school with me today?" she asked. "I told my teacher that you saved people on a plane, and she wants you to tell the story." Elizabeth and Richard exchanged a look and laughed. "Yes, sweetheart. And maybe your dad can come too and tell his part of the story." "Which part?" "The part about how sometimes people learn important lessons in the most unexpected ways," Richard replied, pulling his daughter into a hug. That afternoon, in Sophia's classroom, Elizabeth and Richard told the story for the 100th time. But this time to an audience of 7-year-olds who listened with wide eyes. "So Mommy saved everyone?" a boy asked. "She saved 2 patients," Richard corrected gently. "But she also saved me, in a different way, but just as important." "How?" another child asked. "She taught me that what matters in a person isn't how much money they have or what clothes they wear. What matters is how they treat others, especially those who can do nothing for them." The children grew thoughtful at this. The teacher, a middle-aged woman named Paula, raised her hand. "Dr. Elizabeth, Mr. Richard, do you have any advice for these children?" Elizabeth thought for a moment before answering. Treat everyone with kindness. Don't judge people by their appearance, and remember that everyone has a story you don't know. That classmate who wears simpler clothes might have the most generous heart. That quiet boy might have the brightest mind. Give everyone a chance. Richard added, and when you make mistakes, because we all do, have the courage to admit it and change. It's never too late to become a better person. The children applauded, and the class continued with other activities. But Elizabeth saw that some of them were truly processing what had been said, little seeds being planted. That night, back home after putting Sophia to bed, Elizabeth and Richard sat in the backyard, looking at the stars. Did you ever imagine, Elizabeth said, on that day on the plane that we would end up here? Not in a million years. At that moment, I saw you as inferior, as someone who shouldn't even be in the same space as me. And now, you're my partner, my best friend, the love of my life. And you, who I saw as the embodiment of everything wrong with the world, ended up becoming one of the greatest agents of positive change I know. People can change, Richard said thoughtfully. Not always, not easily, but when they find the right reason, when they have the right example, deep change is possible. Do you think that's what we're doing? Showing people that change is possible? I hope so. Because if someone as stubborn and arrogant as I was could change, then anyone can. Elizabeth laughed and snuggled closer to him. You know what's funny? Sometimes I still have to pinch myself to believe this is real. That awful moment on the plane led to all this. Maybe that's how life works. The worst moments sometimes lead to the best changes. They remained silent for a while, just enjoying each other's presence and the quiet night. There were no more turbulences, no more storms, only peace earned through hard work, many difficult conversations, many courageous decisions. But the story doesn't end here, because transformation stories never truly end. They keep spreading, creating new waves of change. Julia, the young doctor Elizabeth had operated on years before, was now leading her own clinic in another underserved community, following exactly the model she had learned. Daniel, the doctor who had transformed during his rotation, had left private medicine completely to work full-time with vulnerable populations. Richard's hospitals had inspired other entrepreneurs to rethink their own practices. One by one, other private hospitals began implementing similar changes, realizing that humanity and profit didn't have to be mutually exclusive. In medical universities across the country, the case of the airplane incident and the subsequent transformation was studied. Students debated medical ethics, social responsibility, the true meaning of success. And somewhere, on another plane, on another flight, a similar moment might be happening. Someone being judged unfairly, someone having the opportunity to learn a difficult lesson. And who knows, maybe that person would also choose to change. 20 years had passed. Elizabeth was now 65 years old, still working, but at a calmer pace. Richard, at 62, had handed over the day-to-day management of the hospitals to Philip, who was doing an extraordinary job carrying his parents' vision forward. Sophia was in medical school, obviously, following in her mother's footsteps. Marina had her own mental health center, offering affordable services to those in need. On a sunny afternoon, Elizabeth received an unexpected invitation. A major international medical magazine wanted to do a story on her career and impact. She reluctantly accepted, never having liked the spotlight. The interview took place at the clinic she had founded over 3 decades ago. The reporter, a young man named Richard, asked many questions about her career, her choices, her legacy. Dr. Carter, he asked at the end, if you could give one piece of advice to the next generation of doctors, what would it be? Elizabeth thought for a long moment. Remember that every patient is a whole person with a history, a family, dreams. They are not just symptoms or diseases. Treat them as you would want your own family to be treated. She paused. And never ever judge someone by their appearance or social status. A person's worth is not in their bank account. It's in how they treat others, especially those who can do nothing for them. That's a lesson you seem to have learned deeply. Was there a specific moment that solidified this belief? Elizabeth smiled, thinking of a turbulent flight 20 years ago. There was, and interestingly, it was a moment when I was being judged in the worst possible way, But from that terrible moment came growth, change, and even love. Can you elaborate? She told the story then for the 1,000th time, but still with emotion. The airplane, the humiliation, the emergencies, the revelation. Richard listened, fascinated. And the man who humiliated you? Did you keep in touch? We did, Elizabeth replied with a smile. In fact, I married him. Richard's jaw dropped. You married the man who threw money at you and said your clothes were horrible? I did. Because he proved every day after that the change was real, that he had learned his lesson and was committed to being a better person. That's unbelievable. That's life. Sometimes the most incredible stories are the true ones. The article was published 3 months later and went viral. People from all over the world were commenting, sharing, discussing. Some criticized Elizabeth for having married someone who had treated her so poorly. Others celebrated the story as proof that redemption is possible. Elizabeth would read the comments occasionally, but didn't let them affect her much. She knew the truth. She knew the man Richard had become. She saw every day the positive impact they had created together. One evening, a few months after the article's publication, Richard entered the room with his tablet, laughing. "You have to see this," he said. It was a TikTok video, a young woman reenacting the airplane incident. It had millions of views. The comments were full of discussions about judgment, redemption, second chances. "We've become a meme," Elizabeth remarked, both amused and horrified. "It could be worse. At least it's a meme with a positive message." True, although it's still weird to see our personal story being dramatized by teenagers on the internet. They laughed together, and then Richard grew serious. "You know, I've been thinking about something." "What?" "Writing a book, about our story, about the lessons learned, about how business and humanity can coexist. Not as a self-indulgent autobiography, but as a real guide for people who want to make changes in their own lives and organizations. Would you write it alone?" "No. I wanted to write it with you. Our story together, our complementary perspectives. What do you think?" Elizabeth considered the proposal. On one hand, she had always been a private person. She didn't like exposing her life. On the other hand, if their story could inspire other people to change, to be better, wouldn't it be selfish to keep it just for themselves? "All right," she agreed finally. "But on one condition. It can't be just about us. It has to include the stories of all the people who were impacted. Joseph Miller, Luke, Julia, Daniel, all of them." "Perfect. That's exactly what I was thinking." They spent the next 6 months working on the book. They interviewed dozens of people whose lives had been touched by their journey. Doctors who changed careers after seeing the clinic's model. Patients who received dignified treatment for the first time. Business owners who rethought their practices after learning their story. Each interview was a revelation. They had no idea of the true reach of their impact. A doctor in Pennsylvania had opened a clinic inspired by Elizabeth's model. A business owner in Colorado completely overhauled his company's policy after attending one of Richard's lectures. A young woman who was considering giving up on medicine decided to continue after reading about Elizabeth's work. The book was launched on a special evening at the clinic. There was no excessive glamour, just genuine simplicity. Patients, staff, friends, family all gathered to celebrate not just a book, but a journey of transformation. During the launch, several people asked to speak. Joseph Miller, now 80 years old but still strong and healthy, told his version of the airplane events and how that day made him value every moment of life. Julia, now an established doctor with her own clinic, spoke about how Elizabeth not only saved her life physically, but gave her purpose and direction. William, the pilot, retired for 5 years, shared how witnessing that transformation inspired him to be more mindful and compassionate in his own life, and then it was Sophia's turn to speak. At 27, she was in the final year of her medical residency, following in her mother's footsteps but with her own style. "Growing up as your daughter was a constant lesson in humility and purpose," she began, her voice emotional. "Many people ask me what it's like to have parents famous for this amazing story, and I always say the same thing. The most impressive part isn't the dramatic story of the plane, it's the consistency. It's seeing every day, year after year, My mother treating each patient with the same dignity. It's watching my father make difficult choices to uphold his values, even when it was easier to fall back into old habits. She looked at her parents with tears in her eyes. You taught me that character isn't about grand moments. It's about the small, consistent choices we make every day. Thank you for being my role models. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Elizabeth hugged her daughter tightly, and Richard joined the embrace, creating a moment of pure family connection. The book became an unexpected success, not because it was scandalous or full of gossip, but because it was honest. Richard didn't hide his mistakes, didn't try to paint himself as a hero. He was brutally honest about his arrogance, his prejudice, his flaws. And that honesty resonated with people. Letters started arriving, emails, social media messages, people sharing their own stories of transformation, some directly inspired by the book, others simply wanting to share that change is possible. An executive from a large corporation wrote about how the book made him realize he was treating his employees like numbers, not people. He implemented changes and saw not only satisfaction increase, but productivity as well. A teacher wrote about how she began applying the book's principles in her classroom, treating all students with equal dignity, regardless of their performance or behavior. She saw incredible changes in students who were previously considered problematic. A young doctor wrote about how he was about to accept a lucrative job at a hospital that discriminated against patients. But after reading the book, he refused and chose to work in an underserved community. He was happier than he had ever been. Each story was a reminder that small actions can create huge waves of change. But not every reaction was positive. Some critics accused Richard of trying to clear his conscience through good deeds, calling him a hypocrite. Others questioned whether his motivations were genuine or just a sophisticated marketing ploy. Elizabeth saw Richard reading these critiques one evening, his face growing increasingly tense. "Don't pay attention to that," she said gently, taking the tablet from his hands. "How can I not? They're saying everything we've done is a sham." People will always question. They'll always look for negative angles. But we know the truth. The thousands of people who were helped know the truth. That's what matters. What if they're right? What if deep down I'm just trying to redeem myself and not genuinely changed? Elizabeth held his face in her hands. "Richard, look at me. Do you think I would have married you, built a life with you, had a daughter with you if I thought your change wasn't real? No, exactly. You've changed, truly. And yes, maybe it started as an attempt at redemption, but along the way it became who you truly are. The initial redemption might have been the catalyst, but the person you are now is authentic." He pulled her into a hug, feeling the tension leave his shoulders. "Thank you for always believing in me, even when I don't believe in myself. That's what partners are for." The years kept passing. Their work evolved, but never stopped. Elizabeth gradually reduced her hours at the clinic, but never fully retired. She said medicine was in her blood. It was who she was. Richard also stepped back from active management, but remained as an advisor, ensuring the values he had implemented were maintained. Philip was doing excellent work, further expanding the inclusion and patient-centered care programs. Marina opened a second location of her mental health center. Her accessible and compassionate approach was changing lives, one therapy session at a time. Sophia completed her residency and, to no one's surprise, chose to work at the clinic her mother had founded. But she brought her own ideas, her own energy. Under her leadership, the clinic expanded its services, including mental wellness programs, support groups, and preventive health education. It was a Thursday afternoon when Elizabeth was at the clinic, supervising Sophia as she treated a difficult patient. A young mother with 3 children, no health insurance, with symptoms that were being ignored elsewhere. Sophia conducted the appointment with competence and compassion, exactly as she had learned from her mother. She ordered the necessary tests, explained everything carefully, made sure the patient understood not just the diagnosis, but also the treatment and next steps. When the patient left, Sophia turned to Elizabeth. "So, how did I do?" "Perfectly. You were patient, thorough, compassionate, exactly what she needed." "I learned from the best," Sophia smiled. You've surpassed the teacher. You have your own style, your own approach, and it's wonderful to see." They walked together down the clinic hallway, and Elizabeth felt a wave of gratitude. She had dedicated her life to this work, and now she was seeing the next generation take the lead. The legacy would continue. That evening, back at home, Richard was in the backyard tinkering with his new hobby, gardening. He had discovered in recent years that there was something therapeutic about working with the soil, planting things, watching them grow. "How was your day?" he asked when Elizabeth joined him. "Good. I watched Sophia treat a patient today. She's ready. Better than ready. She's brilliant. She had a great teacher. She had two, actually. She learned compassion from me, but she learned resilience and determination from you." Richard smiled, continuing to plant tomato seedlings. "You know what I realized today?" he said after a moment. "It's been 25 years since that flight. 25 years, a quarter of a century. It feels like both a lifetime and just yesterday." "I know what you mean." They fell into a comfortable silence, working together in the garden. It was these kinds of moments that Elizabeth valued most now. Not the big events or recognitions, but these small daily intimacies with the person she loved. "Do you regret anything?" Richard asked suddenly. "About my life?" "No. And you?" "Only the years I wasted being an awful person. I think about how much good I could have done if I had learned the lessons earlier. But maybe you weren't ready to learn earlier. Maybe you needed the shock of that specific moment, that public humiliation, to really open your eyes. Maybe. But still, no regrets," Elizabeth interrupted firmly. "Look at everything we've built. Look at the lives changed, our children, the impact we've had. That wouldn't have happened if things were different. You always know what to say to make me feel better. It's one of my talents." They laughed together and the conversation drifted to other topics. Plans for the weekend, Philip and his family's visit next week, the new book Elizabeth was reading. But that night, lying in bed before sleep, Richard couldn't stop thinking. 25 years. So much had changed, but so much had stayed the same. Elizabeth still tirelessly dedicated herself to her patients. He still worked to ensure his hospitals maintained the highest ethical standards. The difference was that now they did everything together, supporting each other, balancing each other. The following month, they received an invitation to speak at an international health conference in London. It was a significant honor, a global recognition of their work. They accepted, seeing it as an opportunity not to promote themselves, but to spread their message even further. The trip was the first time in years that they took time away from work just for themselves. They arrived in London 3 days before the conference, giving themselves time to explore the city, walk through the old streets, eat at local restaurants, simply being together without the constant pressure of work. On a sunny afternoon, walking along the waterfront, Elizabeth stopped and looked at the ocean. "You know what I remember when I see water like this?" she said. "What?" "That day on the plane, looking out the window at the clouds, feeling that arrogant man humiliating me, and thinking how some people will never understand what really matters in life. And now I think about how wrong I was. Some people don't get it, that's true, but others can learn. Some just need the right moment, the right lesson to completely change." Richard pulled her into a hug. "You gave me that chance. When you could have easily dismissed me as a lost cause, you saw potential. Or at least, you saw the possibility of change. It wasn't generosity, it was pragmatism. You had resources, influence, the ability to make a real difference if you could be convinced to use those resources properly. Always practical, even in our most romantic moments," she laughed. "Someone has to keep their feet on the ground in this relationship." The conference was a success. Their presentation on integrating humanized medicine with sustainable business practices was met with enthusiastic applause and many questions. Several hospitals and clinics from different countries expressed interest in implementing similar models. But the most impactful moment came after the presentation, when an elderly woman approached them. She must have been around 80 years old, walking with difficulty supported by a cane. "Dr. Carter, Mr. Morgan," she said with a heavy Portuguese accent, "I need to thank you." "Why?" Elizabeth asked gently. My grandson read your book 2 years ago. He was working as an executive at a bank making a lot of money, but he was miserable. Said he was selling his soul every day. Tears began to fall down the woman's wrinkled face. After reading the book, he left the bank. Now he works at a non-profit helping families in debt. He earns much less, but for the first time in years, I see him happy. Truly happy. She held both of their hands. You saved my grandson, not from a disease, but from a meaningless life, and I wanted you to know. Elizabeth hugged the woman, and the three stood there for a long moment, connected by this story of transformation that happened thousands of miles away. When they returned to the United States, a surprise was waiting for them. Richard's 3 hospitals had been recognized by an international health organization as models of excellence in humanized care and ethical practices. It was a recognition that validated years of hard work and difficult changes. The award ceremony was grand, full of important figures from the healthcare sector. But when Richard went on stage to accept the award, he called Elizabeth to join him. This award is not mine, he said into the microphone. It belongs to everyone who believed it was possible to do things differently. It belongs to the doctors and nurses who embraced the changes even when they were hard. It belongs to the patients who gave us honest feedback. And most of all, it belongs to this woman beside me, who taught me that true success isn't measured in profits but in lives touched. The applause was deafening, but for Elizabeth, the most meaningful moment came later, when a young doctor approached them. Dr. Carter, I graduated 2 years ago and was about to accept a job at a cosmetic clinic where I'd make a lot doing cosmetic procedures. But then I did my internship here at Mr. Morgan's hospitals and saw how you do things. He paused, emotional. I turned down the cosmetic clinic. Now I work at a basic health unit, and for the first time I feel like I'm really being a doctor. It was always like this. The official recognition was good, but the true reward was these stories, these changed lives, these better choices being made by people inspired by their example. The years kept moving forward. Elizabeth was now 70 years old, Richard, 67. Both still active, but at a slower pace, savoring each moment instead of rushing frantically as they had for so long. The clinic was now completely run by Sophia, with Julia as the deputy director. The 2 women made an extraordinary team, carrying Elizabeth's legacy into the future while adding their own innovations. Richard's hospitals were under the leadership of Philip, who had expanded the inclusion programs even further, creating partnerships with universities to train the next generation of healthcare professionals in ethical and humanized practices. Marina had written her own book on accessible mental health, which was becoming required reading in psychology courses across the country. One special evening, the whole family gathered for dinner. Philip and his wife with their 3 children, Marina with her partner and their 2 adopted children, Sophia with her husband and their newborn daughter, the first direct grandchild of Elizabeth and Richard. The house was full of laughter, overlapping conversations, children running around. It was chaotic and loud and absolutely perfect. Elizabeth held her little granddaughter Emma in her lap, marveling at that tiny being. 4 generations now. Her mother, who had passed away 10 years ago but lived to meet Sophia. Herself, Sophia. And now, Emma. What are you thinking about, Grandma? Sophia asked, sitting beside her. About legacies, about how the things we do echo through time, affecting people we'll never know. Your legacy is huge, Mom. Just look at everyone here. Look at all the lives you've touched. It wasn't just me, it was your father too. It was teamwork. The best kind of team. Richard approached, sitting on the other side of Elizabeth. Are you having a deep conversation without me? Always, Sophia joked. Someone has to balance your tendency to make everything about business. Hey, I've gotten much better at that. It's true, Elizabeth agreed. You've become almost human. Everyone laughed, and the conversation drifted to lighter topics. But later that night, when everyone had left and the house was quiet again, Elizabeth and Richard sat together on the sofa. You know I still haven't completely gotten over it, right? Richard said suddenly. Gotten over what? The guilt of what I did that day on the plane, of the people I probably mistreated before that and don't even remember. Richard: I know. You always say I've redeemed myself, that I've changed, that I've made a difference, and logically I understand that, but emotionally I still carry that weight sometimes. Elizabeth turned to face him fully. Do you know the difference between you and most people? Most people make mistakes and either don't acknowledge them or acknowledge them but don't change. You not only acknowledged and changed, but dedicated the rest of your life to making up for it. The guilt you feel isn't a weakness. It's a reminder, a guarantee that you'll never go back to being that person. You always know what to say. 25 years of practice. He kissed her gently, a kiss full of gratitude and love accumulated over decades. Thank you, he whispered, for everything, for giving me a chance when I didn't deserve it, for believing in my change, for building this incredible life with me. Thank you for having the courage to truly change. Many people promise, few deliver. It was in that moment, in that comfortable silence that comes from years of true partnership, that Elizabeth realized something. She was completely happy, not in the dramatic way of grand celebrations, but in the quiet and profound way that comes from a life well lived, from right choices made consistently, from true love shared. 3 years later, there was a special celebration. 30 years since the incident on the plane. The date wasn't something they normally commemorated, but the family insisted on doing something special. A gathering was organized not just of the family, but of everyone who had been touched by the story over the years. Joseph Miller, now 83, but still active. Luke, the boy who had the allergic reaction on the plane, now a 32-year-old adult, a pediatrician working with underprivileged communities. William, the pilot, brought his wife. Jennifer, the flight attendant, now a training manager for a major airline, incorporating lessons of dignity and compassion into her programs. Hundreds of people showed up. Patients who had been treated at the clinic, doctors who had gone through the rotation program, business owners who changed their practices after learning the story. It was a celebration not just of a transformative moment, but of all the waves of change that spread from it. During the celebration, a video was shown. Testimonials from people all over the United States, even from other countries, talking about how they were impacted. A doctor in Canada who implemented similar programs, a hospital in Argentina that adopted the equal care policies, a clinic in Mozambique that was founded inspired by Elizabeth's model. Watching that video, Elizabeth finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of her legacy, not with arrogant pride, but with humble gratitude. She had dedicated her life to making a difference, and the evidence was there, in front of her, in the faces and stories of people whose lives had been transformed. When it was her turn to speak, Elizabeth walked to the microphone slowly. At 73, she still had that calm and authoritative presence that had always characterized her. When I boarded that plane 30 years ago, she began, I was going to a meeting I thought was important. I had no idea that the true meaning of that day would be completely different from what I imagined. She looked at Richard in the front row. I was humiliated that day, judged, treated as inferior, and it was awful, but it was also necessary. Not for me, but for the person who humiliated me. Because sometimes we need intense moments of shame and self-awareness to truly change. My message to everyone here is not about easy forgiveness or automatic second chances. It's about recognizing that real people can make real changes if they have the courage to face their flaws and the determination to become better. She paused, emotion evident in her voice. But it's also about recognizing that none of us can make a difference alone. I couldn't have built the clinic without the support of dedicated doctors like Julia and Sophia. Richard couldn't have transformed his hospitals without directors willing to embrace difficult changes. We couldn't have created this movement without each of you who believed it was possible to do things differently. The applause was warm and prolonged. When it finally subsided, Richard went up to join her on stage. My part is simpler, he said. I was a jerk. I became less of a jerk. And that was only possible because of this amazing woman and all of you who didn't give up on me. His brutal honesty, even after all these years, still had the power to move people. There were laughs mixed with tears in the audience. "But I want to say something serious," Richard continued. "To anyone here who is struggling with their own flaws, their own moments of shame, their own realizations that they might not be the people they thought they were. It's not too late. It's never too late to change. I am living proof of that. It will be difficult. There will be people who won't believe in you. There will be moments when you yourself won't believe in you. But if you keep choosing to be better, day after day, eventually you become better, and then your life becomes about something bigger than yourself." The celebration continued through the night, but for Elizabeth and Richard, the most meaningful moment came at the end, when they were alone in the car driving home. 30 years, Richard murmured. "It seems impossible. And yet here we are. Are you happy?" he asked. "With how everything turned out?" Elizabeth thought carefully before answering. "Happy is a small word for what I feel. I am fulfilled. I am grateful. I am at peace. We built something meaningful together. We created a beautiful family. We touched countless lives. Yes, I am more than happy. I am complete." "Me too." They drove the rest of the way in comfortable silence, hands intertwined. 1 year later, Elizabeth was at one of her routine medical checkups when Dr. Peter, her own cardiologist and former colleague, turned serious after reviewing her tests. "Elizabeth, I need to talk to you about something." She knew immediately from his tone that it wasn't good news. "What is it?" "Your tests show some heart irregularities. Nothing immediate, but concerning. We need to run more tests." 2 weeks of testing confirmed the diagnosis: cardiomyopathy. Ironically, the cardiologist had a problem with her own heart. It was manageable, but it meant changes. Less work, more rest, regular medication. Elizabeth received the news with the pragmatic calm of someone who had spent decades dealing with medical realities. Richard, on the other hand, was devastated. "It's not fair," he said that night. "After all you've done, all the lives you've saved. Life isn't fair, Richard. You should know that better than anyone. But you always took care of everyone. Someone should take care of you. And someone does. You, our family. I'm in good hands." Still, she held his face in her hands. "Hey, look at me. I'm not dying. It's a manageable condition. I'll have to slow down, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Maybe it's the universe forcing me to finally take that partial retirement everyone's been asking me to take." He held her tight, and she felt his tears wet her shoulder. "I can't lose you," he whispered. "You won't. Not yet. We still have plenty of time together." And they did. Elizabeth followed the medical guidance strictly. She reduced her hours at the clinic to just a few per week, more as a consultant than an active doctor. She spent more time with family, with Richard, doing things she always wanted to do but never had time for. They traveled a little, nothing strenuous, just quiet trips to beautiful places. They spent time at the farm they had bought years ago but rarely visited. They read books, watched movies, had long conversations about everything and nothing. It was a different phase of life, slower, more contemplative, but not less meaningful. Sophia took over the clinic completely, and Elizabeth found she could let go without anxiety. Her daughter was more than capable. The legacy was in good hands. 2 years passed this way. Elizabeth was now 76, Richard 73. They were on the porch of their farm, watching the sunset, when Richard asked a question that had been on his mind. "If you could go back in time, to that day on the plane and avoid all the humiliation, would you do it?" Elizabeth Carter considered carefully. "Part of me wants to say yes. No one likes to be humiliated. But if I avoided that moment, I would avoid everything that came after. Us, our family, all the good we've done together." She looked into his eyes. "So no, I wouldn't change a thing. Even though it was so painful at the time? Especially because it was painful. The most important lessons often come wrapped in difficult moments." He kissed her hand gently. "You are the wisest person I know." "I've only had 76 years to develop that wisdom." They laughed together, and the sun continued its descent, painting the sky with oranges and pinks. Another year passed. Elizabeth Carter's condition remained stable, thanks to constant medical care and lifestyle changes. She had adjusted to her new pace of life, finding peace in quieter activities. It was during this time that she began writing a second book. This one specifically focused on her journey as a woman doctor in a male-dominated field, the challenges she faced, the lessons she learned. It was a way to process her own story, but also to inspire the next generation of female doctors who would face their own obstacles. Richard Morgan was immersed in his own project, working with Philip to establish a foundation that would continue their work of promoting ethical medicine and humanized business practices. The foundation would provide grants, training, and resources to hospitals and clinics that wanted to implement models similar to theirs. On a particularly beautiful spring morning, Elizabeth Carter woke up feeling especially grateful. There was no specific reason, just a general feeling of deep contentment. She looked at Richard Morgan still sleeping beside her, his features softened by sleep. This man who had started as her adversary had become her greatest source of support and love. Their journey had been unlikely, sometimes difficult, but always worth it. Richard Morgan opened his eyes and caught her looking. "Good morning," he said with a sleepy smile. "Good morning. Why are you looking at me like that?" "Just appreciating. You know I love you, right?" "I know, and you know I love you more than life, right?" "I know." They stayed there for a while longer, just existing together, in no hurry to start the day. It was these simple moments that Elizabeth Carter valued most now. Elizabeth Carter's book was published the following year, and, like the first, resonated deeply with readers, particularly with female doctors who saw themselves in her stories, who recognized the challenges she described because they had faced the same ones. A young female doctor wrote saying she was about to give up after facing constant sexism in her hospital, but the book inspired her to continue and fight for changes. Another woman, an established 50-year-old doctor, wrote thanking her for validating experiences she had thought were unique to her, but which the book showed were systematic and shared by many. Richard Morgan and Phillips Foundation was officially launched at a ceremony that brought together important figures from the healthcare and business sectors. The goal was ambitious: to transform the way medicine and business interact in the United States, proving that profit and humanity don't have to be opposites. The first grants were awarded to 5 hospitals and 10 clinics that demonstrated a genuine commitment to change. The foundation would provide not only money, but also consulting, training, and ongoing support. It was the beginning of something that could outlive both Elizabeth Carter and Richard Morgan, ensuring their legacy continued for generations. That autumn, there was a special family gathering. Everyone together at the ranch for a long weekend. It was rare to coordinate everyone's schedules, but they made it happen. The children ran across the lawn. The adults were chatting in groups. Food was being prepared for a barbecue. It was chaotic in the best way possible. Elizabeth was watching everything from a comfortable chair on the porch, a blanket over her legs even though it wasn't particularly cold. Richard was by her side, also watching. "Look at what we built," he said softly. "It's beautiful, isn't it? More than I ever imagined possible." Sophia approached with Emma, now 4 years old, a vibrant and curious child. "Grandma, can you tell me the airplane story again?" Emma asked, climbing onto Elizabeth's lap. It was a story the children loved to hear, always asking for it to be told again. Elizabeth settled her granddaughter and began. "Well, a long, long time ago, your grandma was on an airplane." As she told the story, simplified for a 4-year-old's understanding, Richard watched. There was something deeply moving about seeing that moment being passed down to the next generation, becoming a kind of family legend. When Elizabeth finished, Emma thought for a moment. "Was the bad man on the airplane, Grandpa?" she asked with the brutal honesty of small children. There was a moment of tense silence, but then Elizabeth laughed. "Yes, dear. It was Grandpa. But he learned to be a better person." "Why was he bad?" "Because sometimes people are taught the wrong things when they grow up. But the important part is that he learned, he changed, and he spent the rest of his life trying to make up for his mistakes." Emma considered this with the seriousness only children can muster. Okay, everyone deserves a second chance, right, Grandma? Exactly, dear. The child jumped off her lap and ran off to play with her cousins, having already forgotten the conversation. But the adults present fell silent for a moment, processing the depth of those simple words. Everyone deserves a second chance. That was the core message of everything they had built. Not that everyone should receive automatic forgiveness, but that people genuinely capable of change should have the opportunity to prove it. The weekend passed too quickly, as good times always do. When everyone had left and the house was quiet again, Elizabeth felt a slight melancholy. "Are you okay?" Richard asked, noticing her expression. "I am. Just thinking about how fast time flies. It seems like just yesterday I was holding Sophia as a baby, and now she has her own daughter. Time really does fly." "Richard, I need to tell you something." Her tone made him instantly alert. "What is it?" "It's nothing bad, relax. It's just, I've been thinking a lot about legacies lately, about what we leave behind. You've left an incredible legacy. Everyone knows that. I'm not worried about my professional legacy. I'm thinking about the personal legacy, what I want our children and grandchildren to remember about us." "And what do you want them to remember?" Elizabeth thought carefully. "I want them to remember that we were always authentic, that we made mistakes but owned up to them, that we built something meaningful together, and most of all that we loved each other deeply and supported each other unconditionally. They will remember all of that. How could they not? Do you promise to keep telling our story? After I'm no longer here?" "Elizabeth, don't talk like that. Richard, please, I'm older than you and I have a heart condition. It's just reality. Eventually one of us will go first. And I want to make sure our story keeps being told, not because it makes us special, but because it can inspire other people." He held her hand firmly. "I promise. I will tell our story until my last day, and I guarantee our children will keep telling it after. Thank you." They stayed silent for a long time, hands intertwined, processing the inevitable reality of mortality. The months kept passing. The foundation began to see its first results, with hospitals and clinics implementing significant changes and reporting not only improved patient satisfaction, but also staff satisfaction. Elizabeth Carter's second book continued to sell well and impact lives. Letters regularly arrived from readers sharing how they were touched, inspired, and transformed. It was on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon that something changed. Elizabeth was on the farm's porch, reading a book, when she felt a familiar pain in her chest. She had felt it before, part of her condition, but this time it was different, more intense. She called for Richard Morgan calmly, without panic. "Richard, I think I need to go to the hospital." He appeared immediately, saw her expression, and wasted no time with questions. He grabbed the keys, helped her to the car, and drove quickly but carefully to the nearest hospital. At the hospital, tests were done promptly. Elizabeth had experienced a minor cardiac event, not a full heart attack, but significant enough to be concerning. "We'll need to keep her here for observation," Dr. Peter Mitchell told Richard, "and probably adjust her medications." Elizabeth was hospitalized for 5 days. Richard never left her side, sleeping in an uncomfortable chair and refusing suggestions to go home and rest. "Do you remember," he said one of those nights, "when I was here in the hospital waiting for you after your collapse, so many years ago?" "I remember. I knew at that moment that I cared for you more than I should, more than was wise considering everything. And now so many years later I care even more, if that's even possible." "It is possible," she smiled, "because I feel the same." She recovered well and was discharged with new medications and strict instructions to rest, but both knew this was a reminder, a warning that time was precious and limited. They adjusted their lives accordingly. They spent even more time together, cherishing every moment. They made a point of seeing family regularly. They said, "I love you," more often. A year later, Elizabeth was well again, stabilized with the new medications. She resumed some activities, always carefully, but was living well. It was on a particularly beautiful night, with the stars shining brightly in the farm sky, that she and Richard had a final conversation about their journey. "Do you have any regrets?" she asked. "About anything?" Richard thought deeply. "Only one. I wish I had been a better person from the start, to have had more time being this version of myself with you, But then perhaps we wouldn't appreciate it as much. Maybe it's precisely because we started from where we did that we value what we've built. Always the wise one. Always the romantic. They laughed together, a sound that had become the soundtrack of their lives. I want you to know, Elizabeth continued, that these years with you have been the best of my life. Not just for the difference we made together, but for the simple moments, these moments here, under the stars, talking about everything and nothing. For me, too, you've transformed my life in every way possible. They stayed there until late, talking, remembering, planning the future, even knowing time was uncertain. Another year passed peacefully. Elizabeth was now 78, Richard 75. They had celebrated their crystal anniversary, 33 years together, and still looked at each other as if they were newlyweds. The foundation had expanded, now working in 6 U.S. states and beginning talks about international expansion. The model that started in 3 hospitals was now influencing hundreds of institutions. The clinic Elizabeth founded had grown into a network of 5 clinics, all following the same principles of compassionate and accessible care. Their books were in their 5th and 3rd editions respectively, translated into 7 languages. But more important than any of these external achievements, Elizabeth and Richard had built a close-knit family full of love and purpose. Their children followed their examples, not perfectly because no one is perfect, but consistently choosing to do good. It was all anyone could hope for from a life. End of story. Now tell us what you thought of this story. Did Elizabeth make the right decision in giving Richard a second chance? Share your opinion in the comments. If you enjoyed the story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other exciting stories we will share.